Hi, folks. It's been a busy week on LinkedIn, as per usual, and it was an interesting kind of conversation for customer success this week, too. And there are two posts in particular that popped up that I reposted, of course, and I couldn't help but kind of start a conversation around because both were interesting and insightful, but also came at kind of the same question from opposite directions. And the big question was whether or not a quarterly business review strategy is better than a sentiment strategy. And they both kind of softened the point after they went ahead and led with the strong opener. But I wanted to go ahead and break down both posts real quick and talk about my reactions to them, talk about an example from the meetings I had today, and kind of tuck into why these two in particular stuck out as really especially impactful. So first we've got Rachel Proven. Hopefully I'm saying that right. And her big premise here was that sentiment will not save your customer. So right here, hard truth, a great relationship with your customer will not keep them from churning. That's why CSM sentiment is lousy at measuring customer health. True but embarrassing story. I once had a customer that I talked to all the time who had great metrics churn for a competitor. I was floored. What about all those times we talked about our dogs? We spent summers in the same little town. She even asked me for restaurant recommendations last week. When I asked her what happened, do you know what she said? The other company has features that you just don't have yet. I knew we were leaving, but I didn't want to hurt your feelings because you're so nice. Ouch. She said, great. No matter how much the customer may like you, if your product isn't getting them the results they're looking for, then they're out. A relationship is not a strategy. Great relationships aren't customer success. Great outcomes are. Don't get me wrong, relationships do matter. It's what drew most of us to CS in the first place, but it can't fix a broken product or a bad customer fit. Customers will leave over bad service, but they won't stay solely because of it. And now I'm going to touch on this a little bit briefly, then I'll look at the other posts, and then we'll do some final thoughts. But this one really stood out to me because it kind of dismisses CSM sentiment, that measure, that personal measure of how tight the relationship with is a customer, like whether or not you as a customer success manager are confident that customer is going to stay. And it's, you know what, this is true. You don't want to judge everything just based on stories about your dog. You don't want to judge everything based just on, restaurant recommendations. If you're spending all of your conversations talking about food and just hanging out, you're not getting to the nitty gritty. And actually, in the response that I talked about in my repost, my core piece here is that you do need to talk shop. If you truly have a strong customer success relationship with a customer, you should be talking about the product. You should actually have regular criticisms of your product. You should hear about how they're using it, what's going well, what's not. They should call you mad sometimes because something happened and something came up. You should know kind of where the thought process is, and they should absolutely tell you if they're talking to a competitor. These are all the hallmarks of a good, really strong relationship, and those are some of the things that CSM sentiment should read. Now, a lot of the story doesn't really stick out as a problem with sentiment as a metric for customer health. It really kind of sticks out as an issue with training on what sentiment is and how to judge it. And that's one of the really, really hard things to pin down in customer success. Very difficult to train, very difficult for kind of people to really get a handle of, right? Unless they're kind of naturally inclined towards customer success in this kind of semi-salesy customer relationship type position. Um, but it can be incredibly powerful. And let's go ahead and look at the next one real quick before I get too into this. This is from Noah Little, who opened with a strong opener. QBRs are dead, and CSM leaders who mandate them are killing customer retention. I double dare CSM leaders to eliminate QBR requirements for 90 days. Your company won't implode, your retention will skyrocket. The customer might say they want a quarterly business review, but what do they actually want? To see results without wasting an hour on a slideshow nobody reads. After growing from support agent to enterprise CSM with global brands. Sorry, brands, that's terrible. There's a lot in this post. QBRs are a corporate theater that waste 10 plus hours of prep time for a customer. Yikes. Deliver insights that are already 90 days outdated. Exist to check executive boxes, not to drive customer outcomes. QBR should be buried deep in the Finnish forest and left for the wolves. Good job, Noah, of course. By the time you're reviewing last quarter's insights, your customers are already drowning in this quarter's problems. My solution is bi-weekly 30-minute focus sessions, no slides, no bureaucracy, just results. You'd be amazed at what you can showcase in 30 minutes consistently. Your CSMs are creating PowerPoints while customers are creating exit plans. The best CSMs don't wait for quarterly meeting to prove value, excuse me. They make sure the customer feels it every single week. The question isn't if you'll kill your QBRs, it's whether you'll do it before or after you've lost your best customers. Act accordingly. I wonder what the retired CSMs will say about this one. And this one comes out swinging. They both kind of do, and they both come from opposite perspectives. Rachel's one really sort of emphasized that the fuzzy wuzzy part, the relationship piece, isn't enough by itself. And Noah's here is talking about how the kind of rote do this thing by the letter is actually bad for building relationships. And these two are both somewhat opposite, where Noah is actually emphasizing the relationship collaborative piece, and Rachel's kind of downplaying it in terms of the higher metric piece. And they both are dancing around the same question that's a constant struggle of customer success. And that is obviously it's an expensive role. You need really highly qualified people who spend a lot of time and effort putting in the customer relationships, the customer face time to actually see the benefit of this. And it's difficult. There's that incredible push and pull, right? Where leadership teams want to see metrics. They want to see like the sales metric. How much did you sell? What's in the pipeline? How does this impact our bottom line? How is this actually working? Whereas your more relationship focused people want to make sure your customers are happy, that they're nice, that they're friendly, that they are getting the relationship that is rewarding to them on an emotional level. The real focus should be somewhere in the middle. And now Noah's absolutely right here to a point that if you have a rote presentation that you have to do every single time, that is like you have to fill out this slide, this slide, this slide, and this slide, it has to be a full hour. It has to make sure they sit down and read every single slide. You have to go through the whole thing every time. If it's a very strict, you will do all of this way every single time, then yes, that is a waste of time. That's not going to build a relationship because no matter how much prep time you put into it, your customers are going to end up feeling like their time was wasted, right? Just because if you're putting a ton of prep time into a mandatory quarterly business review that always looks the same, they're going to notice. They'll notice the repetitiveness. They'll notice that even though a lot of prep time went into it, it wasn't necessarily for them and addressed to them in this exact moment right now. And Noah nailed that. But Rachel also nailed a similar part of that as well, that you need some of that too, where you need some of that process, you need some of that consistency, you need some of that digging into things, and it doesn't necessarily, sentiment isn't enough. You do need something like quarterly business reviews, right? And to kind of dial this all back, I want to talk about a meeting that I had today that was a particularly good example that landed smack in the middle of this conversation, and is part of why I had to talk about this. So it was my first quarterly business review with this customer this year, and I had the presentation prepped, right? I did not spend 10 hours on it. We had a few slides in the beginning that are the current value, talk about how they're using the product, some basic numbers on the previous year, some information about how it's been using and what's been going well or what's been going poorly. Really kind of impactful slide that's like, here's what you're doing, here's how it matters, and all goes into this. So that was the customized part of the slideshow. The rest of it highlighted the mission statement of the company. It highlighted the kind of value out of the company. And then the rest of the slides are really kind of good, quickly put together detail slides on the different products that we have. Now, I do spend time on the prep on these. I do customize them, but I personally have trimmed them down to make them a little bit leaner and faster to make sure there's less time spent just going through the slideshow, especially if they've seen it before. Because if you're the kind of person who's super prepared, who every single quarter comes to this review knowing exactly what they saw and commented before and touching on that or skipping over it based on the conversation you had, that can feel personal. But if you just go through the same rote speech every single time, that is quickly going to kill that relationship because they'll say, I've seen this before. But for me personally, and especially the company I'm with, there are so many new developments and new products that I couldn't possibly remember it all. And so for me, that quarterly business review slideshow, I know Noah doesn't like the slideshows, was really helpful to actually remember what the products are, where they are in the overall timeline of the products. Like here's your early one, here's your late one, and they interact at different parts of this specific process. I don't want to go into too many details because I don't want to give up too much about the company, but there are a lot of products that are incredibly valuable and needed and in high demand by my customer base. And again, I will not remember them fully every single time. And having these slides to lean on to be like, here's a visual of that. You asked about this. Here's a quick summary. You asked about that. Here's a quick summary. It's still helpful to have that for me, especially I'm in a territory where I'm fairly new. So a lot of my customers haven't seen these for a while because there hasn't been coverage necessarily. So there's a lot of value in that quarterly business review. But I also make sure it doesn't take up the full time. We do the intro slides, we go through the product slides, and we can pop back into that throughout the call as needed, but also I make sure to share it with them after the call so they can look at it on their own time. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I'm sure sometimes they do, and when they need to is when they tend to. So that's really, really good. I trust my customers to read the slide if it's valuable to them, or read the slide deck if it's valuable to them. Now, on this specific call that I went through, I had the slideshow, I went through it, and then after that, I actually jumped into the platform that they're using as a product. And they'd said a couple times, we think things are going really well, we think that things are working well. So I looked at the reporting, I talked about how I get to the reporting, because as per typical, my contacts are the folks that made the decision to get this product, do some of the high level decision making, but they're not the ones who use it day to day, or at least not the only ones who use it day to day. So in part, I was looking out for the other staff members that work with them to make sure that that they had looked at this stuff and made sure that they had were aware of the pulse of the community and how their staff were using it. And their usage was terrific. That was great. Very exciting. Um, but then I asked those probing questions just a little bit about, oh, you have had some alerts. Like, when did this come up? Well, excuse me, that's product specific. So you had some incidents that came up where the product triggered, where it was really important that it worked. And they said, yes, it did work. Oh, and by the way, this was this funny quirk about communication. And I immediately dug into that. It's like, oh, okay, let's talk about that. So I talked about how they set up notifications that go to who. I looked into their specific issue, their specific use case that happened to pop up as we were just casually chatting about the product and how it was working. And now I'm very good at customer success, just to brag a little bit. But I wanted to talk about that part in particular because we were having a conversation. We talked about travel. We talked about my background photo. We talked a little bit about kind of the community and some local food, but we made sure to talk shop. And the casual speech part was also in part in service of making sure that we were just comfortable with each other so that things would just kind of come up as we were talking. But the subject remained the product and our relationship together, as my part supporting and training them on the product, and their part as being users that would let me know what was working and what wasn't, what needed to be fixed, where it was working well. And that was really an important key part of this conversation, because then, because my QBR slideshow was relatively short, because I made sure to ask questions and look at the platform and see their actual live use, I was able to tease out quite a bit. And we got really into this cool rabbit hole where I taught them about the customization of alerts, some other alert types that they could customize and use in a different way than they were using. And they had a bunch of questions that they hadn't known to ask because they either didn't know some of these things were customizable, didn't know some features were there, didn't know some features were included. And now there was some sales element of this. There was a moment where I could demonstrate expertise talking about the products and how they work together. Mostly, though, it was talking about the product they had and how to use it. And that's one of the wildly underrated parts of customer success, is that it's a space where you can make sure people are actually using the product the way it's designed to its fullest, so that if they have an opinion of the product, it's an actual informed opinion where they've seen it, they've used it, they know how it works and how to do it. It's really important. You don't want somebody to look at your homepage and be like, I don't like it, they use the wrong colors. You want them to actually get into it, try the services, try the tools, and have an actual honest opinion based on how it actually works, based on how it's designed. Now, Rachel made a good point that product, let's see, actually, we'll go ahead and go back to that. We'll just pop over here and look at the recent post. We'll go back to Rachel. And she had an excellent point that product matters. And it does, of course. You want to talk about that. But the core point that I wanted to highlight here is she's talking about how you do need hard metrics. You do need to make sure that there is some boxes ticked. You do need to make sure there are some processes followed. And I agree with that. And now, of course, you don't want it to be totally rote. You don't want it to be like, I have done this exact speech. I will say these exact words every single time in this order. It will take this much time. Yeah, that has a very limited value and diminishing returns very quickly, where you want to make sure people feel heard. You want to make sure people feel listened to. And that's why I really make sure to do that hands-on part, talk through what I'm doing, even if they've told me things are working fine and they've told me that they know how everything works. They honestly, a lot of the time, don't know what they don't know. And so a big part of the conversation, a big part of that sentiment isn't just the dog stories. It isn't just the restaurant recommendations. It's teasing out how they feel about the product, how they feel about the relationship with the product and the company beyond just you. Being a customer success contact, you have this privileged position where you usually have a better relationship with your customers than they necessarily have with the company. You want to be able to bridge that gap to the point where the company understands the customers and is taking care of them on the product side, but also where the customers understand the product, where they are making sure that they are letting you know what you can do better, that they're letting you know when things are working and versus when they aren't. And so both of these two posts really kind of dance around that point. And I do think it's hugely important for folks on all sides of this to really kind of think about this and sort of go through it in some detail. You do want some sort of metric. And this is something I also mentioned before, I believe in that last post in my response to Noah, that my absolute best workflow ever, the best one I had, it wasn't a metric of you have to have a quarterly business review with this person every single quarter. Um, and this is similar, very similar to what Noah actually said in his workflow as well, is that what we were taught to do was you had to have a meaningful two-way communication with every single customer every 30 to 60 days. We had stretched out to 60 to 90 as our portfolios got bigger, but it was have a conversation with them every 60 days, give or take. And that was really, really important. That number one metric was the frequency of communication. And it was really left up to us as a judgment call what was considered a two-way communication. It could really literally be a text message like, hey, here's this problem we had last week. Here's a resolution we had. And they say, that's awesome. Thank you. That's boom, done. Then you've had your two-way conversation and you can visit back in the next as something else comes up. And this isn't to say that we didn't have conversations more often than that. It was just to say that the main pressure was on having that productive live communication. If you didn't need to sit down for an hour to do a presentation, that wasn't a metric you had to follow. If they needed a 2-hour training, but not the presentation, you did that. So the big focus was on what the customer needed in service of both the relationship and their relationship with the product and the company. So it was hyper productive, really effective, and customers loved it. Um, but yeah, so that happy medium I'm in right now, I think that the company I'm with right now, it is Raptor Technologies, it's in my profile right there, has really done a great job with the QBR presentation. Really trimmed it down, really streamlined it. It does have the sales slides on it, but with as much product development and releases as are coming out of the company now, like I said before, it's really important. There's actually too much for me to remember live on the calls, and there's a lot that people are excited about and want to sift through. So it's nice to be able to provide that in that space. Now, if that wasn't the case, if we had one product and it never changed, a lot of that could go right out the window, and we shouldn't try to over advertise it. But we're really kind of talking about things we're excited about that are things that customers asked for that really meet needs that we know they have. So it's a very well researched quarterly business review, a very customer centric quarterly business review, and one that has trimmed down that customization. So it is still there, but it's not 10 hours. And of course, that's going to vary by relationship type, right? Some of them do need more prep time and a more detailed presentation, but those are the ones that are actually looking for the presentation. And that's important too. If leadership of a customer wants to sit down and have the full dress down and see every single possible detail and metric, do it. If they don't, or if you're talking to a different level of contact and they have a different kind of relationship style, match to that. The kind of biggest problem actually with both of the statements these two made is Rachel made this point that sentiment is lousy at measuring customer health. I disagree. It's hugely important. You just need to make sure that you are training your customer success managers on how to actually measure that sentiment as a relationship to the product and the company, as well as the personal relationship. But all of that is part of sentiment. It's not just we would hug if we met each other in person. That's good. That's a good sign. But it doesn't actually tell you anything about the customer's relationship with the product. And so that sentiment piece goes a little bit further than just the conversational parts, and that's important. And then Noah, he talked about a QBRs. QBRs as a principle are completely dead, and there I disagree with too, because having some structure, some cadence to your outreach and communication strategy is really helpful to make sure that people don't fall off the radar. If you have a large portfolio of customers, having some list of like, these are the people that haven't had a QBR in the last quarter, these are the priority to reach out to this quarter, that's really helpful. Just like my favorite workflow was, you haven't spoken to these people in 60 days, time to talk to these folks. All of that is just different ways to get at the same core goal, which is a steady, regular stream of communication that is valuable to the customer and also informative to the company. And there are a lot of different ways to approach that. I know that QBRs are popular, they're kind of the current workflow in customer success, and sometimes they're poorly designed, sometimes they're not. But that's not a problem with QBRs themselves, it's a problem with their design. And we really could dive into that, but that would be a much longer conversation. So that's it. That has been my rant. I really enjoyed both of these posts. Love the content that both Rachel and Noah put out. happy to engage with it as much as they'll let me. And yeah, hopefully this is helpful for your time, and let me know your thoughts.